Today I want us to talk about something that's in the Old Testament, but it's something that's not talked about a lot, and frankly, I bet a lot of people don't even know it's in there. It's something that comes from the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. I want to talk about Ezra and Nehemiah in general for just a minute, and to think about them, we think about the Old Testament in general. The Old Testament in general is divided into three parts. There are the historical books, there are the writings, and then there are the prophetic books. The prophetic books are the prophets like Isaiah, Ezekiel. The writings are basically everything that's not historical or prophetic. It includes things like Psalm and Proverbs, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, Job. And the historical books are the books like Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, on like that. And they end with the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. The historical books, as you might have guessed, tell us things that happened. That's why they're called historical books. They tell us about the history of the Old Testament times. Ezra and Nehemiah represent the latest books chronologically of Old Testament history. They record the last of Old Testament history. The Old Testament history ends with the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and then there's a gap of about 500 years between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New. Now, the major part of the Old Testament recounts the history of the Hebrew people and then the Jewish people. We first meet the Hebrew people in the book of Exodus. They are slaves in Egypt. Under the leadership of Moses, they leave Egypt. They wander in the wilderness 40 years. They enter the promised land under Joshua. And once there, they gradually build up their own kingdom. Their glory days are under King David. And at the time of King David, they have a large and prosperous kingdom. After David's death, one of his sons, Solomon, becomes king. And it is under Solomon that they build a temple in Jerusalem. But under Solomon's leadership, things start to decline. And after his death, they split into two parts: Israel in the north, Judah in the south. Now, that means there is no more Hebrew society after that. There is Israelite society in the north and Jewish society in the south. Just two separate countries. You can look at it like if the United States were to split apart. There would no longer be a United States of America. The United States of America would be gone, and there would be two new countries. That would be their situation there. Now, eventually, Israel was conquered by the Assyrians. Judah, which was in the south, lasted a little longer. They were eventually conquered by the Babylonians. And the Babylonians come in over a period of time, and they raze Jerusalem to the ground, and they destroy the Jewish temple there. And they take some of the elites of Judean society captive to Babylon. And after a while, the Babylonians got conquered by the Persians, and the Persians allowed those descendants of the Judeans who had been taken there as captive to return to Judah if they so wished. And that was approximately 70 years after the Babylonians initially destroyed Jerusalem. Now, some of the descendants of the Judeans that had been taken to Babylon had settled in there, and they didn't want to go back to Judah. Babylon was their home, and that's where they wanted to stay. But some of them did want to move to Judah, and so they did. And the Persians allowed them to do that. The Persians allowed them to have some measure of self-government, and they also allowed them to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. And that's what the books of Ezra and Nehemiah concern themselves with. It's about that time when the descendants of the people who had been taken to Babylon as captive could go to Judah and rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. And it is with that, they're going to Judah and rebuilding the temple, that the Old Testament ends. And that was approximately 500 years before the time of Jesus. Now, this process of these people coming to Judah and rebuilding Jerusalem in the temple took a number of years to accomplish. It took many years to accomplish. Now, when they finally got all that done, they decided that they wanted to restore, following the law that had been given to Moses hundreds of years back. There was a problem, though, when they started looking at that law of Moses. The law of Moses strictly prohibited marrying foreign women. The Hebrews and then the Jews were only supposed to marry fellow Hebrews and fellow Jews. They were not supposed to marry women from other people, but they had. Many of those who had come from Babylon had married women that were not Jews. They had married foreign wives, and they had had children with these wives. That was strictly prohibited by the law of Moses, and so they realized that if they were going to follow the law of Moses, that could not be allowed, but yet they had already done it. So what could they do? The book of Ezra tells us that they gathered together and they heard the law of Moses read, and they got upset that they had so transgressed the law. And so they decided the only thing they could do was to just send these foreign wives and children away. And that's what they decided to do. Just send them away. And the leaders said, in 3 days, everybody who moved here from Babylon has to come to Jerusalem for a meeting. If they do not come, we will confiscate all of their property and they will be ejected from the people. In 3 days, a number of people did gather, and Ezra, who was the priest, stood up. And he addressed them and he said, you've got to send all of your foreign wives away, and all of the children with your foreign wives have to be sent away too. And the people replied, well, it's the rainy season, and everybody's busy now because it's the rainy season, and what you're asking us to do is going to take some time to accomplish. So they asked for more time. Ezra agreed to give them more time. Eventually, all had gathered, and the ones who had married foreign wives were identified, and the ones who had children by foreign wives were identified. And they were told to send their foreign wives and children away. It doesn't say they made any provisions for them whatsoever. It just said they sent them away. Now that's disturbing. Can you imagine having a wife and children and just coming in one day and saying, get out. Get out. It's disturbing. And that's the reason I'm sure that we don't hear about this much, although it comprises a major part of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. But it's in there, we're told they did it. It seems so cruel and such a drastic step to take. I do not want to be seen in any way as encouraging abandoning wives and children. People do that enough already. But before we get too upset at these people for doing that, we need to stop a minute to consider why they did it. The book of Nehemiah is very explicit. We heard this earlier as our Old Testament reading, but I want to repeat this. In those days, I saw Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod and could not even speak the language of Judah. They spoke according to the language of one of the other people. So I contended with them and cursed them. I struck some of them and pulled their hair out and made them swear by God. I said, you shall not give your daughters as wives to their sons, nor take their daughters for your sons or yourselves. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things? Yet among many nations there was no king like him. He was beloved of God. God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, pagan women caused him to sin. Should we follow and do the evil that Solomon then did? So you see what was happening. The children they had from these foreign women could not even speak their language. They were speaking languages of other people. And this passage also refers to the example of Solomon. Remember, Solomon was the king when things started falling apart for the Hebrews. And the Bible gives us the reason for why that happened. This passage in Nehemiah and other places in the Old Testament blame it on Solomon having foreign wives. It said Solomon loved foreign women, and it was that led him astray. Because you see, he was influenced by other influences, and he started following the ways of other people. And when he started following the ways of other people, the Hebrew ways declined, and Hebrew society collapsed. In the book of Ezra, Ezra is praying to God, and he said this, "And now, God, what shall we say? For we have forsaken your commandments, which you commanded by your servants the prophets. You said, the land which you are entering to possess is unclean, with uncleanness of peoples, with their abominations, which have filled it from one end to another. Therefore do not give your daughters as wives for their sons, nor take their daughters to your sons, and never seek their peace or prosperity, that you may be strong and eat the good of the land, and leave it as an inheritance to your children forever." You see, when you get right down to it, what is going on here is that the Hebrews and then the Jews had their own culture. They had their own unique way of life. They had their customs, they had their religion, they had their own culture, and that was something that could not be maintained if they let other influences come in. If they mixed it with the cultures of other people, it would no longer be Hebrew culture. If Hebrew culture was this, if you mix it with this, it's no longer Hebrew culture. It becomes something else. The only way their culture could remain pure is if they intentionally kept it pure. And the best way to intentionally keep their culture pure was to remove influences from other cultures. If they started marrying women from other cultures, those women would bring in aspects of that culture into Hebrew culture, and eventually it would disappear. It would be lost in a giant melting pot. They would no longer have their own culture. They would have a mixture of the cultures of other people. The only way they could keep their culture pure was to keep other influences out. But given the whole myriad of ways that influences could come into a culture, why was there so much emphasis on marrying foreign women? It's because they realized that in order for a culture to perpetuate itself, it has to be passed on to children. If a man went out and married a foreign woman, she would teach the children her own culture. She might teach the children parts of Jewish culture, but she would also mix it up with elements of another culture. And so the children would grow up, they'd be taught part Jewish culture and part something else. And that's how they'd grow up. And then they'd grow up teaching their children part Jewish culture, part something else, and part yet something else. And see, it wouldn't take but a few generations until nothing of the Jewish culture remained. Nothing at all remained. There was only one way to maintain the Jewish culture. And that was to be sure that that culture, and that culture only, is what was passed down to their children. The only way for them to maintain their culture was to see that it, and only it, was passed down to their children. Now, while we may look at this thing of sending foreign wives and children away and think, gosh, that's awful, and we may recoil at it, when you back off and think about it, at least they did have some reason for it. It wasn't just something they decided to do. You see, the very survival of their society was at stake. Their society would not survive through the generations unless they made sure that their culture, and not someone else's, was passed down to the successive generations. Now, as a practical matter, of course, as it always goes, not everybody agreed with that decision, and not everybody followed it and sent their foreign wives away. Some people ignored it. And we can look at Jewish history and see the effects of that. There is no Jewish culture today that is anything even remotely similar to what we see in the law of Moses. There are many things that go today by the name of Jewish culture, but it is a hodgepodge of many other things. Most of what people in the United States think of as Jewish culture is actually turn of the 20th century Eastern European culture. And it just goes by the name of Jewish because that's where most Jews came from, was Central Europe. A culture as envisioned under the law of Moses was not maintained. Other influences came in. Today, what is known as Jewish culture has no relationship to the Mosaic law, really, except to Passover and a few things like that. So Jewish culture, as reflected in the Old Testament, no longer exists. Now, I know a lot of people don't like the Old Testament, and I have a lot of problems with the Old Testament too. And there's always been a lot of arguings among Christians as to exactly what to do with the Old Testament, exactly how to approach it. And there's no denying that there's a lot of stuff in the Old Testament that's 180 degrees away from the stuff in the New. There's no way to deny that. That's a fact. But one of the things I learned when I was in seminary is that the Old Testament is full of wisdom if we'll just listen to it. I look at the Old Testament as people 2,500 or 4,000 years ago struggling through life, struggling to make sense of things. And I look at the Old Testament as maybe a way that they tried to pass some of their wisdom on to us. From the pages of the Old Testament, as old as it is and as outdated as it may seem, we can gain important insights that are valuable for us today. And I think one of the insights that they had was that for a culture to survive, it's got to be passed down to the succeeding generations. If you want your culture to survive, then your number one goal, really, should be to be sure that it's passed to the succeeding generations. That's what you've got to do. The people in the Old Testament realized that a culture does not automatically get passed down to children. A culture does not automatically perpetuate itself. It doesn't perpetuate itself at all. It only survives if it is intentionally maintained. If it is intentionally maintained. I know a lot of people are dissatisfied with how things are going in our society today. And I know a lot of people are dissatisfied with some of the viewpoints and values and ideas that people are coming up with today. And I've had people talk to me about that, and they say, I just don't know what happened. I don't know where this stuff came from. Somebody talked to me not long ago and something about their grandchildren were talking about, and they were just floored that their grandchildren would even know this stuff, much less be talking about it. Well, I think we can go to the Old Testament and let it tell us some of the answers to this. I think without intending to, parents today did not pass their culture down to their children. They may have tried to, and they may have intended to, but it was so watered down with other influences that it got lost. Parents were not gatekeepers, guarding the influences their children were exposed to. They doubtless had good intentions. Think, well, what's the harm? Or maybe this different stuff is better. I remember one time, probably 25 or 30 years ago, I walked in this house, and these people had a child that was about 13 or 14, a girl, and she was sitting there watching a TV program. It was the first program I ever knew about on TV that dealt with a certain subject openly and promoted it. And I walked in there, and that girl was sitting there, and I said, I can't believe you're letting her watch that. And they say, well, she likes to watch it, so we just let her watch it. You know, I mean, or maybe parents concentrated on other things. Maybe they were trying to give their children a leg up in life, make their children have a good education, so their children could have a high standard of living or something. Passing on the culture was not high on the priority list. Maybe parents thought it was, but it obviously wasn't. If you don't like what's going on today, as far as our society is concerned, the real reason is that our culture was not passed down. And there's no magic solutions to that. It does entail a cost to pass on a culture. It does entail a cost to pass on a certain way of looking at things and a certain mindset and a certain way of life. It does entail a cost to do that. Maybe it means you can't be quite as prosperous. Maybe it means you have to concentrate on something other than making money. Maybe it means you have to concentrate more on abstracts than material goods. It is expensive. But think of the cost of not doing it.